Alternate Worlds here, back with another What If, and hopefully you guys did enjoy the last few uploads, and I do apologize, I haven't uploaded for a little while, but don't worry, I will continue uploading, and it seems like you guys are really enjoying the What Ifs that have been coming out lately, so don't worry, there will be more coming out very soon. But with all that being said, let's get on with the video. Gojo would look at his stat sheet, absolutely bewildered. His skill was cursed energy. Well, isn't that poetic? He thought to himself, smiling internally. Hestia was shocked as well. She had never heard of a newbie getting a skill so quickly, even without leveling up. Well, Belle, aren't you a lucky duck? Hestia would say, with a big grin plastered on her face. Haha, maybe a little, Gojo would reply, chuckling lightheartedly. So, Belle, what are your plans in terms of going into the dungeon? She asked inquisitively. Well, I think I might go visit Aina at the guild. She seems like a good person to ask advice for about the dungeon, he answered. Hestia would nod at this statement, approving of Belle's choice to visit Aina and ask for advice before heading into the dungeon. As they continued to chat for a little while longer, Hestia and Gojo would fall asleep, letting themselves rest for the day to come. It had been early morning, and 5 a.m. to be exact, as Gojo would already be up and awake, as he decided to take it upon himself to train his body, as it was lacking. As Gojo would start doing a regimen of 100 push-ups, sit-ups, squats, and begin a 10-kilometer run. Damn it, this body's so weak. I need to push it as far as I can, he'd say to himself, mid-push-up. Around 2 hours would go by, and it'd be around 7 a.m. already, as Gojo had just finished doing his squats, and he was already panting heavily, as Gojo would be dripping in sweat, as Hestia, about this time, would begin preparing for her part-time job selling potato puffs, as Hestia would yawn as she would roll off the bed onto her feet groggily. Walking up the stairs to exit the basement, Hestia would open the door for her tired and worn eyes to witness Gojo, all sweated and shirt off, doing his exercise, as Hestia would flush deeply, and she'd be in a deep crimson, like a sheen of crimson would be just on her face, as she would cover her eyes, but really wouldn't matter as she would peek through them, as Gojo would look towards Hestia and give her a small smile, saying, "Good morning, Goddess Hestia," as, well, Hestia would say, "Haha, yes, good morning." She'd have a weird little chuckle to her, as she'd shake off the weird feeling she was getting, and decided to tell him that she'd be heading out for work, and that he should start heading off to the guild as well before it gets too packed. As, Gojo nodded his head, saying that's a good idea, as he decided to clean up before he left, as he was rather not in a very presentable state as of right now, as Hestia had gone off to her job to basically sell potato puffs. Gojo would decide to quickly take a decent bath, I guess. Even if the church was slightly ruined a bit, he could at least take some proper hygienic care for himself, as he would, quickly give himself a rinse, as he would prepare his clothes, as he would get changed, dressed in his usual attire, the usual attire for, Belle Cranel to be exact, but we move on. As he would get dressed, he would basically leave for the guild, as he'd start jogging there, as he still needed to complete that 10k run he promised he'd do, as he decided to take the long route, running, around the city, as he knows he might get lost, and that might be a good thing, as this city was rather large, and he could most likely complete 10 kilometers pretty darn quickly. As he starts running around, he most definitely does get lost, ending up on Daedalus Street, as he found himself in Daedalus Street, as this place was, well, more or less known as the second dungeon of Horario, as, well, its design isn't really, well, good, as it's more of a maze than a place for people to just walk and stroll around, as people would get lost very easily, as the design of things wouldn't really fit per se, as stairs would go into walls and there were no doors, and some would lead into windows and stuff of that nature, and the design really wasn't all that appealing, hence why it was known as the second dungeon of Horario. As Bell would find himself strolling around, he decided to use the arrows that were on the walls and basically get out of Daedalus Street before anything fishy happens. As he does so, he ends up finding his way to the guild, and he may have ran at least a few kilometers by now. So he decided to take a break and go visit Aina, as Aina currently was just finishing up a stack of paperwork, as when she looks up, she witnesses, or she sees, Belle Cranel, as she basically raises her hand, waving towards him, gesturing for him to meet with her, as, well, Belle does so. As Gojo meets up with Aina, he basically greets her as he does, and politely asks her if he can have some of her time and ask about the dungeon, as Aina would be a little bit shocked, as she'd ask him if, well, he had joined a familia, as he had nodded his head, smiling brightly, as he'd say he'd joined the Hestia familia, as Aina would be quite shocked, as she smiled, telling him that that's great for him, and that they should start the paperwork so he could be registered as an adventurer, and he should be able to, at least go into the dungeon with, well, some basic gear that is provided by the guild. As the paperwork, well, gets done, Gojo starts asking Aina about the dungeon and what he should expect. As Aina, well, was glad that Belle didn't decide to go into the dungeon before informing her, and that she was actually giving him good advice, as she would start speaking about the first floor, saying that mostly goblins and things of that nature would spawn up there, and if he went lower, more and more different monsters would start spawning here and there, but he shouldn't have to worry about going so low into the dungeon so far, as he's still level 1 and he should get the hang of it, so he should stay near the first 3, maybe 4th floor, if he gets a bit lucky. And that's pushing it, Aina would tell him, as Gojo would nod his head, putting his hand on his chin, as he would begin contemplating about his plans of entering the dungeon, as Aina would inform him more and more about the dungeon and what he should expect, things of that nature, and as about 30 minutes would go by, as Gojo would nod his head and ask Aina if she had any recommendations upon weapons he should acquire for himself, as Aina would tell him that, well, since he's in a really no-named familia as of currently, then he should most likely start off with the guild's, well, starting equipment, as that would most likely be the most useful for a rookie like himself. So Gojo would, well, basically acquire some of the basic necessities like armor and weaponry, though in his old life he really didn't need much weaponry nor armor, as his armor had been infinity and his weapons, well, was his cursed energy. And, well, he might not have what he used to have, but he most definitely is gonna reacquire or regain some of the things he had in his old life with this skill cursed energy. He didn't know if it was the same or not, but he'll experiment with it as soon as he can find the time. So he would acquire himself his gear and things of that nature, and would continue to ask Aina about what other necessities he might need, like a potion perhaps, or other things, bandages, food, water, as Aina would tell him that he'd only require that if he'd planned to stay in the dungeon for quite a while. He'd only require food, or a little bit of food as for a lunch break or some sort, or if he was going on an expedition, then he'd require plenty. But he didn't really have to worry about expeditions until he got himself into a party, and yeah. So Gojo would nod his head and thank Aina for the time he had, and he told her that her advice was most definitely needed, as Aina would blush a tiny bit as she'd thank Bell, as she had or would have had to get back to work. As Bell left the guild, he decided to pick up his gear. As he does so, he ended up going back to the abandoned church and decided to, well, get some things that he might need, as he did see a few other requirements and necessities he needed. So he went to grab himself a bit of water, and they really didn't have much food as currently, so he didn't really have to worry about that too much. So he decided to, well, explore the dungeon a bit. As he would head out and find himself in front of Babel Tower, he'd smile, saying that an adventure awaits him. As he would enter Babel Tower, he would basically make himself, or make way to the dungeon. As he would enter, he would now be on the first floor, as it looked completely different from the outside world. It's like a cave, but also quite different. As he would find himself looking around in awe, he began walking forward. He would keep walking for a couple minutes until he heard the walls beginning to crack. As he would smile, saying, "Wow, so this is the dungeon," as 3 or 4 goblins would be spawned by the dungeon, as these goblins had a few landform weapons, as one of them had an axe made of stone, and the other had a sword made of stone, as the others just had no weapons. As Gojo would look upon them, he'd bring out his trusty knife, as that was all he really needed. Actually, no, let's not say he got a knife. Let's say he got a short sword instead. Similar to the sword that Megumi used in Jujutsu Kaisen. Let's just say that. Something like that. As he would bring out that short sword or blade, as he begin charging towards the goblins. As the goblins charged as well, attacking in a group. But Gojo was surprisingly agile and cut them down without a problem. As he was surprised, the fauna that he was given actually boosted his attributes far greater than what he expected. As he smiled to himself, thinking that, well, with this boosted power, I reckon I could go pretty far. As he starts cutting down the goblins, small crystals start to appear after, well, the goblins will kind of dissolve into ash. As he picked up these crystals, he'd remember that Aina told him that these crystals could be traded for monetary value. As he smiled, saying, well, I might make myself a pretty penny while I'm at it. As he starts putting the magic stones in his pouch, he starts venturing further into the dungeon, deeper and deeper. As he continues, he ends up seeing a few more monsters. As he begins cutting more of them down, as he decides to try and activate that cursed energy. As he'd close his eyes, trying to feel the cursed energy, and it kind of works, as he could feel it flowing inside his body. As he decides to do something simple, as he charged his fist with a cursed energy, as fiery glow is emitted from his fist as he looks at it. It was the cursed energy. He'd missed the feeling. As he'd smile, saying, "Oh, you're done now," as he'd smile, looking towards the monsters ahead of him. As he tried to imbue his blade with it as it actually works. As his blade was now coated with cursed energy, he began cutting them down. As before, he wasn't really struggling to cut them down, but, well, it was kind of tiring, and I guess it wasn't as swift, and the cuts weren't as, well, sharp. But now with the cursed energy, his movements were a lot more fluid, and his attacks are stronger, faster, and just overall better, as now he cut them down with ease, twice as fast as he did before. As he smiles, thinking to himself, if he can keep, well, practicing with this cursed energy, he would most likely regain his abilities that he once had. Probably not regaining the ability of the 6 eyes and infinity, but he could probably regain the abilities of making his original techniques. Maybe not to the same degree, but close enough to protect himself. As he continues venturing down, he has actually made it pretty far, making it to the end of the 2nd floor. As he continues venturing down, he made himself into the 3rd floor, witnessing a few new monsters, like kobolds. As he would be quite surprised. Kobolds. He'd never seen these before. They look like wolves, but werewolves? He didn't really know, but nonetheless, he began to fight these monsters. As these monsters were putting up more of a fight, and they were much stronger than the previous monsters he had fought. Than the previous monsters that he had just fought. As he'd smile, enjoying himself greatly, as the thrill of battle was getting to him. He enjoyed a fight. As he began cutting down the kobolds bit by bit, he was using his skill, Cursed Energy, way more, as he enveloped his body in Cursed Energy, just in case these monsters actually landed an attack, so that it wouldn't hurt as bad. Seeing as his armor was quite delicate and really wasn't up to par, well, with these monsters, so he'd have to be careful so he wouldn't get scolded when he got back. So he would swing his blade, on a kobold that was in front of him, as his blade would cut through the right shoulder or the left shoulder of the kobold, as he would get split into 2, as the others would back off a little, as Gojo would see that these kobolds are sensing a bit of or feeling fear, as he'd smile, saying, "Get back here," charging headfirst into the kobolds, as he began cutting them down, butchering them, as he'd cut off one of the kobold's arms, as the other one would try running away, as Gojo would jump up and basically stab his blade down into its head, as the kobold would just wither away into ash, as the kobold with his arm that was just taken off would wince and howl in pain. He would look towards Gojo, resolving itself as he would try to claw and bite at Gojo. As Gojo would dodge each and every attack, the kobold would try to cut him in 2 with his claw, but Gojo would basically duck under it and go for its legs, cutting off one of its legs cleanly, as the kobold would fall down, basically crawling on the ground at this point, as Gojo would finish it, as he would basically stab his knife or his short blade into its head like he did with the other one, ending its life as more crystals would drop. As he'd smile at this, he'd think that he'd like to continue fighting these monsters for a little while longer, so he'd stay in the dungeon for at least 2 more hours. As when he returned to the surface and made his way to the guild, Aina would be worried sick, shaking him and asking him if he was alright. But Gojo really didn't have a scratch or mark on him, so Aina was pretty impressed. but also very worried, as she'd lecture him about staying there for too long, as Gojo would just sigh, saying, "Yes, I'll make sure to keep that in mind." As he traded in his magic stone pouch, he'd get, let's say, he'd get himself 13 to 14,000 Valis, as Aina would be a little surprised by this, as a solo adventurer getting this much is pretty impressive. As Gojo would smile, saying, "I might buy my goddess something." As he decided to leave and say goodbye to Aina for now, he decided to, well, look around the market to see what he could buy, as he found himself at a little stand that was selling little trinkets and things, and he found a necklace with the blue pearl, as it wasn't really an expensive buy at all, actually. It was most likely a fake stone, but it looked real pretty and it matched Hestia's colors, white and blue, as this was a really cool thing that Gojo thought he should buy. He decided to buy it with his newly earned money, and he'd decide to go visit his goddess, as his goddess was selling potato puffs, as she was quite happy, as she'd be humming a little tune to herself. But when she opened her eyes to greet her next customer, it happened to be Belle, as she would shout, "Belle!" as she'd give him a hug, as Belle would pat her on the head, saying, "I'm back." As Hestia would smile, saying, "How was your trip in the dungeon?" As, well, Gojo would inform her about everything that has currently happened in the dungeon, as it was quite a success, as he would, well, give her a hug, as Hestia would be a little shocked by this, but returned the gesture. But when Gojo finished the hug, he said, "Look down." As Hestia looked down, she would see something wrapped around her neck. As she would look at it, it was a necklace. As she would blush, as she would look towards Belle, as he'd smile, giving her a really warm smile. As she would start tearing up a little bit, as she would full on start crying, as now Gojo, or Belle, really didn't know what to do. He was like, did I buy the wrong thing? Did I mess up? He'd question himself, as he would apologize to Hestia, saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't know you didn't like it. I'll buy you something else." But as he was about to, try to take off the necklace, Hestia jumped into his arms, giving him a great big hug, as she tackled him to the ground, as he was quite shocked by this, because now, one moment he was standing up, the next he was staring at the sky on his back, with his goddess, well, tackling him to the ground and hugging him so tightly he could barely breathe, as he would basically start wheezing, saying, "Goddess, I can't breathe." As Hestia would cry into his shirt, she'd say, "Thank you, Belle. You don't know how much this means to me." As Gojo would smile, patting her on the head, telling her that she should get back to work before her boss gets angry. As Hestia would jump up, saying, "Right, I'll meet you later at home. I'll make sure to bring back some potato puffs for you." As he would smile, as he would basically head off, as he was a bit hungry, and he was just about to be noon, so he missed lunch, so he decided to find himself a restaurant that he could stay at for a little while. As he would continue walking around looking for a restaurant, he found himself at the Hostess of Fertility. As he looked inside, it wasn't too full, but it was most definitely booming, as he'd see plenty of waitresses inside, and he'd see a rather large lady at the back cooking the meals, as he'd get a tad bit intimidated, but he'd enter the bar nonetheless. As he'd enter, he'd look around, as a silver-haired lady would greet the customer, as Belle would look at her, as he'd be entranced for a tad bit, but the lady would start saying, "Hello, hello, mister," as Gojo would snap out of it, shaking his head, saying, "Oh, hello. Sorry about that. My name is Cranel," he'd say. As, well, this lady would start giggling into her hand, saying, "You're an interesting one. My name is Seer Flover," as she'd basically put her hand out to shake, for him to shake, as he'd shake it, saying, "Nice to meet you, Seer." As Seer would start her, well, normal friendly chat, as Belle would start getting to know her a little bit as he would be seated at a table or at the counter, as Seer would start talking to him, being a little bit interested in what this boy was doing, as Belle would just introduce himself, telling them that he's a rookie adventurer that just started out today, and he got himself pretty far into the dungeon. As they were talking with each other, the big lady at the back, that was surprisingly kind and boisterous, gave Gojo a big plate of pasta, as she would tell him that a growing boy needs a lot of food, as he'd smile and chuckle a little at that statement and start eating, as Seer would, well, basically head back to her, well, duties and things that she had to attend to, as Belle would finish his meal and end up paying for it, saying thanks, as Seer would talk to him some more, telling him that he should come by in the morning whenever he goes by to the dungeon, and that she'd give him something in return. As, well, Gojo didn't know what she'd give him in return, but he nodded and, well, left, heading back to the church, as Hestia would just be finishing up her job. She'd also be heading, well, heading back to the church as well. As they'd end up meeting up at the church, Hestia would have herself a big bag, or a decently sized bag of potato puffs that weren't sold and were leftovers, as Belle would have brought himself a small little container that held a bit of pasta that he had, because he knew his goddess might have wanted some. As they looked at each other and laughed as they entered the church, heading towards the basement, and indulged in some more food. As, well, Belle and Hestia would end up sleeping the night away, as morning would come pretty quickly, as Gojo would basically be doing his same morning routine, but it's getting a little bit easier now. As this continues on, let's say this continues on for 2 more weeks. Let's say 2 more weeks. As 2 more weeks would pass, Gojo would have gotten a lot stronger, like a lot stronger, as Hestia would be shocked that his status would be growing pretty quickly. Not at the rate of, well, Belle in the original, since he had Realis phrase, but pretty damn good as well. For a rookie adventurer to be gaining this much Excelia and gaining this many points in his attributes is quite impressive. As Hestia would smile at him, as he'd also nod his head at the compliments. As he was continuing his training, though, his 100 push-ups, sit-ups, squats, and his 10-kilometer run weren't as hard to achieve as his very first day, as he would have gotten a lot stronger, as he would have made himself he would have been able, I apologize for the stuttering, but he would have been able to at least make his way down to the 6th floor all on his own, and it's quite an achievement, he'd think to himself, as making his way to the 6th floor was a lot harder than he expected, as there were a lot more monsters, and they were a tad bit stronger than the ones he had faced before. But the war shadows that he would have fought were a lot stronger and pretty scary looking. But nonetheless, he'd cleave straight through them. But anyways, Gojo would finish up his training and end up heading over to the guild to meet up with Aina for his almost daily advising lessons that Aina would give him every now and then, or almost daily basically. So yeah, Aina would give him more information about the dungeons and his progress and other matters that might interest Bell. As Gojo would nod and, add in a few statements of his own, maybe a few comments to the things that she would say, as other than that, nothing really was out of the ordinary. So he'd end up leaving, giving her a wave goodbye, as he would head off to the dungeon. As Gojo has saved up a pretty decent amount of money at this point, probably around 100,000 Valis, somewhere around there, seeing as on his first day in the dungeon he managed to get himself 12,000 Valis all on his own. So he'd end up getting a little bit more money. Of course, not all of his Valis was kept to himself, as he'd have to use some of it to pay for his goddess's living situation and his own living situation. So he really was a bit tight on money, but he really didn't mind having to get up so early to enter the dungeon. As he would make his way to the dungeon, he'd basically stroll through the first 4 floors, and it'd be pretty easy for him as he'd just be collecting crystals. And when he made his way to the 5th and 6th floor, this is when he started taking it a little bit more seriously. Or 5th floor, as he'd take it a lot more seriously, as it was eerily quiet for the 5th floor. Even though it was an upper floor, there were usually a few adventurers around, rookies just like himself, and maybe a few monsters there to greet him. But right now it was really, really eerily quiet, and it did not sit well with him. His instincts from his previous life would be kicking in, telling him that danger was just around the corner. And oh, how right he was, and he wished he wasn't. As a monstrosity of a bull would start walking his way towards him, slowly, as that monster's blood-red eyes would glare at Gojo's very own. As he would be shocked seeing this monster, half man? No, there wasn't any man in that. That was a beast. As he'd look towards it, as he would remember Aina talking about this monster, but it was on the middle floors, or supposedly on the middle floors. It was a Minotaur. As he'd look towards this giant monster, he'd smile, saying, "Well, I didn't expect to take down a Minotaur." But as he'd take out his blade and imbue it with cursed energy, as he would also imbue his own body with cursed energy for defense as well. As he'd smile, saying, "Well, I'd take on a challenge any day." As he would dash towards the Minotaur, as the Minotaur would roar, as the Minotaur bellowed, it also began to charge at Gojo. As both of them would collide, both of them would end up clashing with each other's weapons, as the Minotaur had himself a club, as Bell's dagger or short blade would collide with this club. It wouldn't break, but it would creak or start cracking a bit, as Gojo would be shocked. He imbued it with cursed energy, and even with him imbuing it with cursed energy, this behemoth's brute strength was able to crack his blade, as he'd get tossed back into a wall, as he'd cough up a bit of saliva, as he would basically be in the wall, not really indented into the wall, but he would slide off, as his mind would start thinking in overdrive, as he'd realized he put himself in a rather precarious situation, as he was not ready to take on this monster, and he did not want to die just yet, as he'd end up beginning to clash with the Minotaur yet again, as this time he would be not just attacking head on. He'd start moving, swaying side to side, and going in unusual patterns that would confuse the Minotaur, giving him a chance to attack it, as he had realized that this thing would most definitely have a thick hide, so he would start by taking out its legs. As he'd do so, his blade would make contact with the Minotaur's calf, as he would manage to slice it a bit, but even with the imbuing of cursed energy, he still wasn't strong enough, and his cursed energy wasn't at the level that he was in his previous life, so he was only able to give it a minor little scratch, and that was most definitely not going to take this monster out, as Bell or Gojo would be shocked as he would jump back, dodging or narrowly dodging the swing of the monster's club, as the Minotaur would bellow yet again and start trying to strike out at him again, swinging his club violently, as Gojo would be struggling to dodge them, even with his fauna and his slight stat levels or stat increases. He would be struggling, as this Minotaur was, well, stated to be at least the level of the mid-tier adventurers, which is like second or third class adventurers. As he would begin trying to, as the Minotaur would actually land a strong, powerful hit to Gojo, as he would be sent into the wall, as he'd basically get indented into the wall as he would slide off, as he would fall on his face, as he would groan, "Ah, that hurt, you big monster." As he'd look up towards the Minotaur would give him an evil smile, as if it was telling him that you're finished. As Gojo, currently at his state and power, was most definitely going to be finished, but that didn't happen. As a golden-haired, or what seemed to look like a princess, rescued him, as with her desperate in hand, she would cut down the Minotaur. With very swift, fluid motions that did not waste any energy or power at all, destroyed the Minotaur, basically cutting it limb from limb, as the Minotaur's blood would spray all over Gojo. As, well, the Minotaur would end up vanishing, leaving behind a crystal. As Gojo would look dumbfounded and bewildered, he'd basically just look stupid, with his mouth agape, looking towards the person who rescued him, as she would extend a hand towards him, saying, "Are you alright?" As Bell's eyes would widen, as he would have heard of this specific person from Aina, as she was known as the Sword Princess, the record holder for leveling up the fastest to level 2, and was one of the strongest members in the Loki Familia, a powerhouse Familia that rivaled that of even the Freya Familia. As he'd look towards her, as Gojo would suddenly start feeling a bit strange, as his heart would skip a beat. Skip a beat? His heart never skipped a beat. What was this strange feeling what was this strange feeling? He'd never felt like this before. It was weird, and he did not like it. It wasn't normal, and what wasn't normal was not good, he thought to himself, as he would basically stand up and, well, try to look away from the Sword Princess, as she'd look confused, tilting her head to the side, asking if he was okay yet again, as he would basically say, "Yes, I'm alright, thank you." But before Wallenstein could start asking any more questions, or, basically start asking any more questions about his well-being, Gojo would have bolted, ran as fast as he could. He doesn't know why, but his body, it feels like his body, heart, mind, and soul, all in one, decided to make himself run. He didn't know why, but it felt like it was the right thing to do. So he just bolted. He ran. He did not scream. He did not yell. He just ran. Ran all the way back home, passing the guild, as people from the street would start looking at him, seeing a kid that just exited the dungeon, fully covered in blood, as people would start talking and chatting behind Bell's back or Gojo's back, but he really did not care. At this point, he was just trying to calm himself from whatever he was feeling, as it wasn't normal and it wasn't appropriate for him to act in such a manner. As he would run all the way back home, telling his goddess of what happened, as his goddess would be shocked seeing him in such a state. as well, he'd basically end up getting a bath and cleaning himself off before heading back to the guild, as he would run to the guild. As well, Aina would be shocked and asked him of what happened, as she'd take him to a private area where they'd usually chat. As Aina would start berating Belle with her anger and very worried concerns about his well-being, as he would sigh, saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," but he'd end up informing her about a rather interesting piece of news, as Gojo would tell her that there was a Minotaur on the 5th floor, and he didn't know why, as Aina would be quite shocked. A Minotaur on the 5th floor? What was it doing up there? She'd questioned. But she'd have to worry about that later, as she now was way more worried about him, asking if he'd got any major injuries, if any bones were broken, anything like that. As he would answer her, telling her no, that Miss Eyes Wallenstein ended up saving him. As Ina's eyes would open wide, saying, "Miss Eyes, the Sword Princess?" As he'd nod, as Gojo himself wouldn't realize it, but when Miss Eyes' name was mentioned, he would turn away, as his cheeks would, flush a tad bit red, as Ina would catch on immediately, as she would get herself a very sheepish smirk, as she would basically bump Belle's shoulder, or bump Belle with her elbow, saying, "Well now, does someone have a little crush?" As when Ina whispered it into his ears, now he would be flushed full red. He didn't know why, and he did not want to know why he was acting this way. It was strange. He'd never acted this way in his previous life, and he didn't know why he was acting like this now. As he would calm himself, saying that it wasn't like that, and he just really wanted to, try to get to know her more. As he didn't know why he said those words, but he said those words. He wanted to get to know the Sword Princess. And Ina would start smiling and chuckling to herself, saying that Belle might get to meet her again sooner rather than later, so he shouldn't worry too much about it. As they had their usual conversation and report from the dungeon, as Belle would head on home, thinking about why he was so fixated on, getting to know Miss Eyes Wallenstein more. He didn't know why, but he just wanted to. As he wanted to know about her more, as now his heart was beating faster. As a fixation grew, he wanted to get stronger now all of a sudden, because he now realized he was saved by a girl, and he would not stand for it. He wanted to be the one saving the damsel in distress. In his old life, he would be saving plenty of damsels. Saving plenty of damsels. But now he was getting saved by the damsel instead. This reminded him of a story that old man used to talk about. It was the story of that Argonaut guy. He remembered a memory from, this body's past, of his younger self, about the story of Argonaut and the things of that nature. He'd remember Argonaut would be a hero, or used to be a clown that decided to become a hero. As he'd remember that, he'd sigh to himself. "I guess I'm a lot like Argonaut," he'd think to himself, as he made his way back to the church, as his goddess would be very worried. Sick, since he just ran out after he took a bath and got dressed. So she didn't know if he went back into the dungeon or not. But he told her that he just went to visit Ina and had a few questions to ask her. But anyways, he wanted to ask the goddess if he could update his status, as the goddess would update his status, as everything that was, everything in his status would have jumped up a lot. Everything, literally everything. His strength from I don't know what letter it would be, but from 204 with strength would be now pushed up to at least 370, pushing 400, as his speed would be the highest, pushing 550, as everything else would be around 380, 370, lowest being his defense being around 280, his defense being around 280, as Hestia would be shocked, as when she was updating his status, a skill popped up. As she would read this skill, she would be livid. She did not know what was happening, but it seems like when Belle went into the dungeon, he might have met the girl, as she would basically start punching Belle's back, as Gojo would look or try to look up towards her, saying, "What's the matter? Stop hitting my back. It hurts, you know." As Hestia would puff her cheeks out as she was pouting, as now she was upset. Belle may have had a crush, and she didn't know who it was, but she knew it must have been a new person he met in the dungeon, because he didn't have the skill the last 2 weeks he was in the dungeon, but of all the days that he went into the dungeon, when he came back, he got a new skill. So now she was very, very suspicious of Belle, as she would make her intent to hide the skill very evident, or I can't say the word, can I? But she would basically intend to hide the skill from him, as she knows that if any of the gods or goddesses found out about this skill that he had, he would most definitely become a target for their amusement, as the skill would be known as Realis Freeze. As the skill, if you watch the show, would allow Belle in the show to grow at an exponential rate, but it would only continue to work if he had feelings and strong desires for a specific person. So basically, if he was in love and had strong feelings for the person he fell in love with, he would be able to grow and become madly strong very quickly. And currently, Gojo was starting to experience something like that, as Hestia would not like it in the least. As she would change the stat sheet, she would basically change or hide the skill from from Belle, as she would hand him his stat sheet, as he would be quite surprised at his sudden increase in stats, as he would smile at his goddess, saying, "Thanks again for updating my status," giving her a warm smile, as they would end up finishing up their nice little dinner and head off to bed. But I think I'm going to leave it off here for now. If you want part 3, please comment down part 3, and make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I will be posting another video very soon, so make sure to keep that in mind. And if you don't want to miss any other videos, hit that bell so you will never miss out on another new upload. But with all that being said, I'm going to see you all next time. Peace.